It is well understood that the use of constraints, asking a person to brainstorm within certain parameters, actually increases a person's ability to be creative, enabling lateral thinking rather than inhibiting it. While intentionally limiting one's creative choices may seem stifling for some, embracing the constraints inherent to my own craft has proven to be nothing short of liberating. Constraints have become one of the main catalysts within my work, and developing an appreciation for how they guide my thought process has given me an unexpected insight into the works of others. Artists have long imposed arbitrary constraints on themselves, which we call aesthetic choices. Scientists design experiments that constrain physical outcomes to the point that they may reveal novel data about the world. For me, learning and creating within fixed parameters, treating the acquisition of knowledge like a puzzle in need of solving, was how I approached much of my early work. When I was 19 years old, one of my first real-world constraints that I encountered was that I was a college dropout without a lot of money and for a short time, without a permanent place to live or practice my art. As I set about cobbling together a live workspace, I began buying equipment to teach myself metalcraft. It became clear that constraints, both material and conceptual, would be an overarching theme for much of my life in artistic practice. In the absence of formal instruction, I found myself taking an incremental approach to sculpture. I would acquire and teach myself how to use various pieces of metalworking equipment and apply them to my work one process at a time. I found myself designing my sculptures around each process I was trying to master, and that process would in fact become a secondary theme for each of my works. I became aware that I was largely making aesthetic choices within the larger goal of technical achievement. These early works dealt primarily with bending and shaping metal using blowtorches, welders, and grinders. My early interest in metal was the duality of working with steel both while hot and cold. You can heat and melt steel and achieve organic forms, or drill it and cut it while cold to achieve more geometric shapes. I spent my early years exploring the contrast in this material fact. Before long, my formalistic investigation into fabrication processes led me down a much more complex and technically demanding road, and into the world of modern machine work. Machine work is the most technically complex craft I have ever come to know. To have a basic grasp of it requires one to be familiar with myriad spheres of knowledge. It encompasses the material sciences and all manner of engineering, multiple math disciplines, as well as chemistry, computer programming, and too many more to name. It is a holistic craft that touches every facet of our modern world. Virtually everything in this room was manufactured either directly or indirectly because of machine work, and yet as a vocation, it is remarkably underrepresented in the arts. As an artist who was attempting to build an aesthetic around the inherent constraints of an ever-evolving set of processes, moving into machine work proved a creative boon. It was immediately obvious that a process that would translate into a broad understanding of the built environment around me was my calling, and it drastically changed the nature of my work. So for the last 15 years, I set about mastering various aspects of highly technical and wide-ranging vocation, continuing my early practice of building works around various engineering and machine-related concepts, all the while maintaining an awareness of how that process, how those processes I was learning were informing the creative decisions that I was making. In time, I taught myself how to build and program my own machine tools. I learned how to convert low-cost manual equipment into much more sophisticated robotic or CNC machine tools. I built a number of CNC milling machines and lathes. I restored and repurposed older machine tools for new uses, and designed, re-engineered, and invented countless fixtures, jigs, and ancillary tooling to realize my designs. In addition to machine tools, I built a 3D printer, set up an anodizing lab, and experimented with heat coloring and kiln-baked powders using a modified pottery kiln. I pursued any industrial process I felt could be scaled for a solo artist practice to investigate how it could be tapped for creative insight. Each work became a literal evolution of process and design, the previous serving as a catalyst for the one that would follow. I took the same approach to the art of drafting. I experimented with interesting ways to convey information about the underlying structure of each of my works. I was trying to inject aesthetic choice while faithfully communicating how the works were engineered. I continued to experiment with this concept. Okay, so the things that look like things. So you're making abstract work like mine. You inevitably get comments about what your work looks like to other people. Just the act of putting feet on something can trigger all sorts of comparisons to science fiction robots or creatures, or even specific tools or instruments. People cannot help but project their worldview onto your work, and it can be a sort of Rorschach test, revealing as much about the viewer as it does about the work. And I always felt that I should encourage this, which is why I don't title my artworks in any recognizable way. It is an attempt not to lead the viewer. I want people to bring their own ideas and viewpoint to the work, and I have benefited from them sharing those perspectives with me. But I must admit that I've not always known how to react to the comparisons that have been shared with me, as it can be trivializing at times. Because my interest in sculpture is firmly rooted in the idea of process and how that can inform personal aesthetic, other people's non-technical views sometimes cause me discomfort. Science fiction comparisons in particular bothered me at first, not because I did not understand the shared industrial history of that aesthetic, but because I was engineering art that quite intentionally had no fictional narrative. I had no interest in surrounding my designs with made-up functions or backstories. I felt that creating an engineered art object in itself was interesting. I rebelled against this idea for a time by trying to be subversive. In this case here, I designed a stereotypical rocket ship form to make sure I understood my enemy, and then on the right, I made a rocket that would never go anywhere to subvert that same form. But in time, I began to see references for my work everywhere. I would see many of the design choices I felt that I was making in the isolation of my own studio, showing themselves out in the real world, like this donut roller on the left. I decided that this was an interesting conceptual layer worth investigating on its own. One thought I had was that from a very young age, we are conditioned to understand how to interact with the built world around us. Through user interface design, we are subconsciously trained to understand how to operate coffee makers, cars, elevators, smartphones, and all of those often without official instruction. I began to see the shared language between my work and the engineered objects around me as an opportunity to play on psychology. So I began intentionally designing works that spoke to this expectation that highly engineered objects create. But I often eschewed the clues and design elements that would betray any possible functionality or use. It made the works paradoxical, full of implied yet undefined purpose. It made the works irresolvable and by extension more captivating. But it seemed to me that there were other forces at work as well. The tools and materials themselves seemed to constrain design choices to the point that common design themes seemed all but inevitable. Across disciplines and function, I could see how certain design elements arose again and again, even if the designers were completely ignorant to the relationship. Maybe some would say it's just lazy design, but I think the truth is more nuanced and more interesting. Which leads me to this idea of inevitable design, which is a short way of saying that there are certain design compositions that work so well that they are destined to arise again and again, given the proper material constraints. Some obvious examples. The rough idea being that in our early history, if you wanted to make a big structure and your constraints were such that all you had was stone to build with and gravity to work against, then a pyramid shape was a natural solution, which is why we find that so many different cultures built them. And history is littered with examples of inventions that, although novel at the time, seem all but inevitable in retrospect. And although these are engineering and science-related examples, I think this applies to the arts. Some circumstantial evidence. In the middle is a work that I made while exploring the creation of texture using rotary tool paths. Surrounding it are Tibetan vihara. Another example, my work in the middle with a couple of vihara. And so this is where I admit my own ignorance, as I did not know what a vihara was when I created these works. My design choices were made deep inside a technical rabbit hole of my own making. But once it was pointed out to me, the similarity is unmistakable. So did I copy, or did I subconsciously reference an object I had never heard of? Instead, I reasoned that there must be process constraints at play that led to this creative convergence, something inherent to the craft that informed both of our approaches to this form. A more science-related example, pointed out to me by the physicist and painter Friedrich Wagner, who during an artist talk about the shared values of the arts and scientists showed this image. On the left is one of my works from 2009, and on the right, a diagram of the mass tokamak fusion reactor, of which he was intimately familiar. And one final example that's closer to home for me, and so easier to understand the forces at work. On the left is a machine spinning top by the artist Richard Stadler, and on the right is one of my own designs. Both of us are machinists working with aesthetics who arrive at similar design concepts, a similar design concept without prior knowledge of each other's work. Having done this kind of work for so long, it is easy for me to piece together the thought process that would lead someone else to this exact same design solution. So by extension, it is also possible for me to imagine that in a more complex situation, one with more data points and looser constraints, how something just as similar is possible, but that it may be harder to detect in a more convoluted environment. I think many of us in the creative fields have come across a tool, work of art, or piece of design that, because of our own experience, intuitively understand the subjective choices that were made to arrive at that result. So to summarize, when most creatives are staking out intellectual property and copyright, it might be worth saying that just because things are similar, whether they look or sound like something that already exists, does not always mean an idea was copied or stolen. There may be less obvious structural forces at work when we as humans are lateral thinking, and it might just be that the constraints of our material world and information environment are at play, forces that cause many of us to arrive at similar creative results again and again. So is it wise to claim ownership of an idea given the likelihood that future creatives may stumble onto similar insights on their journeys to more original work? If we wall off concepts as our own, do we risk stunting the work of others by dissuading them from exploring work that may cross over or even surpass our own? Thank you.